Okay, I'm going to call the meeting of the Corporate Services Committee to order. This is the 11th meeting. I'll start off by reading the following statement. The City of London is committed to making every effort to provide alternative formats and communication supports for council, standing or advisory committee meetings and information upon request. To make a request for any city service, please contact accessibility@london.ca or 519-661-2489, extension 2425. I'll look for any disclosures of pecuniary interest. Seeing none, we have 3 consent items. I'm going to have item 2.1 dealt with separately, which is our 2019 tax policy, the 2019 education rates, and a report from myself on the Federation of Canadian Municipalities board meeting back in March. Does anybody want to deal with those separately, or can we deal with them together? Looks like together. All right, so maybe we'll do those 2 first then and get them out of the way, and then we'll do tax policy after. So I'll look for a motion for consent items 2.2, which is the education tax rates, and 2.3, which is the receipt of a letter from myself, moved by Councillor Kaibaga, seconded by Councillor Hillier. We'll do that on the system, but Councillor Hammer, you're looking for some comments.
Yeah, just briefly on 2.3, I just wanted to say it's excellent to have you in the role of vice chair for the election readiness piece. I think that's a really important time for FCM to be advocating for municipal priorities. This is obviously an important election cycle for municipalities, and I think having you as the vice chair is really helping to bring London's voice to FCM and to really influence those priorities in the direction of what mid-sized cities in particular in Canada need. And I'm really glad to see that you're taking on that role.
Mayor Holder.
Thanks very much. Not nearly as eloquent as Deputy Mayor Helmer, but let me say that as a former member of Parliament, I did come to appreciate the role of FCM and having you, and particularly from an election readiness at this time, really does matter. And I think some of the outcomes, as you have indicated, the influence of FCM in terms of the gas tax, that one-time opportunity that we're receiving in particular, that does matter to us. So compliments to you and FCM on this. The pressure continues in a nice way. I know it will in Quebec City as well, as we have more representation federally at that. But well done, and I just want to say thank you.
Thank you for those comments, and for those who don't know what my colleagues are talking about, I'm FCM's vice chair of their Elections Readiness Committee. It's a federal election year. I would just add, I appreciate the kind words, but certainly supported by our government relations staff and their team. They help quite a bit, and they help even produce the report that you see before you. So I appreciate their support as well, and I think it's certainly a team effort. We have some great individuals from the region as well represented on FCM's board, so it's a strong Southwestern Ontario presence at FCM. If there are no further comments, I'll open this one for voting, which is the 2 consent items, 2.2 and 2.3. We're just waiting for one of our colleagues to log in and vote. Just be a second.
Closing the vote, the motion is passed 6-0.
With that, we'll put item 2.1 up for discussion. This is the 2019 tax policy. You have before you comprehensive report from our staff, as well as I'll highlight for colleagues who have never been through this before, really one of the key schedules to look at as we have the discussion that we'll have before us is Schedule B, which outlines the series of options for tax policy and the impacts on different rates. Staff have forwarded their report, which details kind of what the different components mean, where they feel the comfort range is, as well as what's in the bylaw before you. So we certainly have this up for discussion, and I would look for some colleagues to do that. I think I will enter this debate at some point, so I'll probably pass off the chair to Councillor Kayabага to chair this part of the meeting. She's indicated that she's willing to do that at this time, but certainly I have Deputy Mayor Helmer first on the speaker's list. I'll pass the chair to Councillor Kayabага for the rest of the debate.
Deputy Helmer.
Thank you. I appreciate the report, and I think I know we're up against the clock, as it were, in terms of waiting about as long as we possibly could before making a decision here. I think it's a good idea that we're not dealing with the overall future tax policy right now. I think just dealing with this 1 year and putting off the discussion about sort of overall where we headed around tax policy to later, I think is appropriate. I don't think we need to necessarily have the big discussion right now. A couple of things. First, I'd like to move the staff recommendation, which is to go ahead with option AB2. I'm certainly interested in what my colleagues think about that. And there's a range of options on the table, but that's the one I think is my sort of preference. I think it's in line with what we have been doing. And so I'd like to move that and see if there's a seconder for that. I also would like to say a couple things when we are thinking ahead to the future tax policy discussion. One is, for the past several years, we've been, and even with the recommendation that's in front of us today, we've been treating residential, multi-unit residential, and farm all the same way, so equalizing across those three categories. And with this one, we're also trying to bring in the commercial industrial and just bringing down the ratio a little bit. I'm not so sure that the farm class needs to be treated the same way. We've got to a situation now where the farm tax ratio is very, very low in relation to every other municipality in the province, including all of our municipal neighbors who have a fair amount of agricultural assessment, but don't have the same kind of commercial or residential assessment base that we have. So we're able to keep the farm tax ratio much lower than they are, at very little cost to the residential tax base, for example, in terms of how the burden shifts. And it's getting to a situation where there's quite a big disparity between the tax ratios on one side of the border and the other, even in Middlesex County. So I'm just not sure that we need to keep that one in the calculation going forward. I think we could probably let it float a little bit more. I think it's been really good and very positive for farmers in the City of London that we've buffered a lot of the assessment related increases that otherwise would have happened in the class by making those changes. So I'm not saying those are wrong, but that we might not necessarily need to keep doing that. There's only so low that it can go before, right now farmers are paying about 10% of the residential tax rate. It's quite low. The more normal number is around 25% of the residential tax rate. So I think we need to look at that one. I don't want to have a whole discussion about it, but I wanted to say that because I know we will be talking about future tax policy. I want to raise it. Similarly, I think now that we've got the commercial ratio below the threshold of 1.98, that we should be considering a separate ratio, a special class for surface parking. I know that you can have a special class for surface parking. A lot of municipalities have that. Some of them, what they do is they use that to lower the tax rate on parking lots. I'm not really sure why they do that, but to say that this kind of commercial property should be taxed lower than the other kinds of commercial property. I think we should do the opposite, which is to have it at the threshold level. And I just want to raise that for my colleagues to say that, I think having a lower tax rate on a commercial property that's got a building on it compared to a property that doesn't, and it's just being used for parking, I think we should be considering that. I think it's something that's available to us. I don't want to get into a big discussion about it, but I just want to indicate some of the things that I think we should be talking about in terms of future tax policy. Certainly interested in knowing what my colleagues think about this range of options. I think option AB2, the things I like about it is that the residential increase is lower. You know, we're talking about 1.2% residential increase, once you're factoring in the education rates. I think that's very reasonable. It's also reducing the range of variance between the different kinds of property classes. So you've got a high of 4.5 for the commercial properties and a low of 0.9 in the industrial properties. This is really not a big range. They're being sort of the average increase is pretty close, much closer than you see in direction one, for example, where farm would be 15%, you know, multi-unit residential before, you know, there's a big variation in those ones. So I think AB2 is the right kind of balance. It's equalizing the burden. It's dealing with some of the bigger assessment related increases that we're seeing year over year. So I think that's the appropriate way to move forward.
Councillor Morgan.
Yes, I'm happy to second option A, B2 for many of the same reasons that Councillor Helmer outlined. And I agree with his comments on discussion on future tax policy. I certainly think that there are things that we should consider, and I also appreciate having the debate a little later on so that colleagues can go through this cycle of setting the tax ratios once. We can certainly consider and discuss and engage with staff on the types of options that would be available to us, and then engage in a robust discussion on the overall tax policy and set a multi-year direction that we can follow the framework on. So I'll look forward to that discussion, and I appreciate some of the things that Councillor Helmer has said should be considered in that discussion, and I think certainly those will be good things to discuss and engage and consult on. I will say I think that AB2 is a very fair option. It's very similar to what we did last year, and I appreciate Mr. Logan and his team providing a similar option to what we did last year, because I know we had a little bit of delay and back and forth, and I appreciate the time pressure on this particular one with us getting the education rates very late and us basically having to pass something through council so we can actually get the tax bills out. The reason why I think this is fair is a couple of reasons. One is everyone benefits from the education rates, and that's all the tax classes. They all come down from when they otherwise would be through that application. And the commercial, which is facing an increase because of the value of that property going up, we're lowering that ratio. Once again, this will be the third time we've done it since I've been on council, which provides some permanent relief by shrinking the ratio between commercial and residential rates. And so I think that's appropriate, and it actually provides a little bit of relief for that commercial increase. I do think landing a majority of the education tax on the residential components is appropriate. I think the 1.2% tax increase that Londoners will face if they own residential property in the City of London in 2019 is fair. It's certainly less than what we budgeted for, and that's why during the budget I always say this is one important part of the discussion on tax rates, but it's not the only thing, and it's certainly not the piece that actually sets what you actually face. So when people get their bills mailed out and they get the brochure, it's going to say 1.2%, and that's going to be the average that the homeowner faces if we pass AB2. I think it's fair for multi-residential too. I know I don't have a ton of multi-residential in my ward, but I do appreciate that other parts of the city do, and bringing that rate down to 1.6, I think is the appropriate thing to do. Putting money in people's pockets where they live tends to help the economy, and I think that's a good way to go. I agree with Councillor Helmer's comments on the farm rate. I think that warrants some analysis. For now, I'm comfortable taking the same approach that we've taken in previous years, and we'll deal with that in the overall tax policy. And finally, I'll say, overall, these are tricky decisions. There's a lot of options on the table, but my goal in this has always tried to balance fairness over a multi-year basis. And when you look at going back to 2013, you can see that we haven't really been balancing it with the use of our tax policy and the way that the education rates have been applied. This has been a much more fair approach, not just in an individual year, but over a longer time horizon. I still, we've certainly the main beneficiary over the long time horizons have been commercial and industrial rates at the expense of residential, but I think we're kind of correcting that now and balancing that out, and I think it's probably a fair long-term approach to tax policy, and we'll set the next long-term approach to tax policy when we have the larger discussion. So again, happy to support the option AB2. Thank our staff for the work, and would encourage my colleagues on the committee to support as well.
Any other comments or questions? Mayor Holder?
Question, and that has to do with the farm rate. One thing that I've been curious about, as a large urban center in southwest Ontario, and I know we're surrounded, I always used to call London an urban oasis in the sea of agriculture, but how much agriculture is there actually within our city's boundaries from either an acreage or tax base or dollar value? I'm trying to get a sense of that, and I wonder if staff might be, through you, Chair, be able to provide some insight to that as we look at this, the farm rate percentage as well.
In my ward, a majority.
Through you to staff.
Would you like to answer that, Mrs. Barbour?
Schedule C will give you some feeling for what portion of the municipal tax levy is attributable to farm. You can see the farmland's a separate line on there, and it's quite a small proportion of the total revenue of the city. You can see it's less than, it's about $600,000 municipal taxes out of $606 million. And the number of properties, I think there's something like 630 or so properties that are involved. And sorry.
And through you, Chair, and how many acres would that be in London? I appreciate that this is a small number tax dollar-wise.
I don't have the information as to the area, acreage, or anything like that off the top of my head.
It's interesting, Chair, because when we were in debate for this office, and I'm sure a number of you, as we ran, a lot of the discussion was around all the farmland in London, Ontario, and I don't think it's as great as we think it is. And listen, I eat every day reasonably well, I think, so I appreciate farmers, and I was just trying to get a sense of what that value was. Do you mind if I ask then a separate question through you, Chair, to staff? And under AB2, I see the increase in commercial and industrial rates fairly significant. And I know we always try to figure out our rebalancing and the like, but can you shed some thoughts as to these numbers relative to the other options that you presented, please?
The percentage increase is reflected in the first box there. I'm not sure exactly if I'm answering the question correctly, but the ratios drive the percentage increases, so that the ratio you adopt for a class affects the increase in the class as well. Education taxes affect the increase in the class. One of the issues that is on the agenda is education taxes. And education taxes are a very significant component of commercial and industrial taxation, much more so than for residential properties. And there is a significant issue there that perhaps is very relevant to commercial industrial properties in the city, and that is the way the province imposes education property taxes. And this is what it was recommended in that report was contacting the Minister of Finance by the city with a view to lowering education tax, the property taxes in the city. And there are big issues in that area, but with respect to the increases here and why they're different, every time there's a reassessment, value changes differently in different property classes. And that is really what drives the different increases in the different property classes, is the changes in values being different in the different property classes. And the ratios are a method that you can adjust that and mitigate that. And also in the report that perhaps is at the issue you're talking about is Schedule A. I believe it's Schedule A. It's the tax ratio in all the different municipalities. So that gives you some idea how all the various municipalities in the province are treating the different property classes. And you can see, I think the comment is in the report, that our ratio in London is around the middle. It's slightly above, but around the middle of, if you look at all the ratios in the different property classes in the different cities. And what we have done is we've recommended some reduction in the commercial ratio to adjust and mitigate the increase in that class. The other comment I would make is that there's another year in this cycle which the pattern will be similar next year to what it is this year. After next year, we go into 2021 where there will be another reassessment, and it's subject to how market values change. It can change quite differently every 4 years when the cycle is renewed. So we don't know at this point exactly what it'll look like, but we do know that residential properties increased quite a bit recently.
Thank you, Chair. So just to follow up from your comments, sir, and that has to do with the education taxes, and you indicated that there may be some move from the city, I think is how you said it, to approach the province. Can we elaborate on that a little bit? Because I'm mindful that the province is certainly under some pressure to do what it needs to do to work towards balancing its budget. I'm not sure how positively they would receive this, but to the extent that it has dramatic impact on all the classes that we deal with, can you explain, is that specifically our intention to send a letter? Does that come from the mayor? Does that come from our city manager? What's the timing on this? Can you just shed some light on specifically what it is that we're precisely asking the province as it relates to the education component of the tax bill?
Yeah, in the report on education taxes, we did send a letter last year. The mayor sent a letter last year to the previous government, the provincial Liberal government, and a response was received late in the year, around December, and from the current government. And the reason the letter was sent is I believe it was 2012, the province indicated they were going to bring uniform tax rates for education purposes to all the commercial properties in the province, commercial and industrial properties in the province. It's a long story, but historically the tax rates were different in every different municipality for education. And the province took over the system, and they have not yet made them uniform in the commercial industrial. So as a result, London does pay a higher commercial education tax rate than some other cities. And that's the point. They did promise in 2012 to unify the system. However, they ran into problems and they started running a deficit at the provincial level. And they were unable financially to keep up what they had promised. And they said they would unify the rates when the budget is balanced again. Now, the budget was theoretically balanced in 2017, or the year of the election. And then the issue was raised again, because we raised the issue again as going back to their promise in 2012. I'm sorry, it's a long story, but what we're doing is trying to remind the province of what was indicated quite a few years ago about what they intended to do, and it hasn't been done yet.
Thank you. Do you have one final question? Okay.
Thank you. Then just tied into that, obviously this has such an impact on our all of our different classes associated with taxation. I'm not sure. I'm not here to speculate whether the current government is going to feel beholding to past policy determinations from other governments. But I would certainly encourage that we produce that letter to them relatively quickly. I would hope that that would be something we do to, I think, bring some reasonableness to these tax rates. Ultimately, there's only one taxpayer, and I'm mindful that if we're not competitive, or in some aspects partly not competitive as a result of inappropriate allocations of tax assessments based on years gone by, I definitely would like to see that fixed, and would be happy to write that letter this afternoon if that's the appropriate protocol, but certainly sooner than later. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Van Holst just joined our meeting and he'd like to ask a question.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. Schedule H is one that I'm always very cognizant of. The 7 out of the 8 issues for in economic development indicate that property tax ratios are high in terms of their significance. So the fact that we have a trend of industrial going downwards is very important. And so I think I'm happy with AB2 as well, because we do see in overall the tax ratios going down. So anyone looking at and seeing the trend in London, it's a positive trend. May not be that significant. That's just from 1.93 down to 1.92. Some of the other strategies, AB1, for instance, takes that down a little further. However, the impacts for residential are substantially higher, so 0.5% higher. So it is, I think in terms of that, we're still in a positive situation. So I would support this direction as well.
Thank you. Councillor Helmer.
Mr. Logan, in one of his relatively long answers to the mayor, addressed what I wanted to say, which was that the assessment-related increases in the commercial property class are being offset a little bit if we go ahead with AB2. I didn't want that point to be lost. He did say it at one point, which is to say we're using the ratio to offset what otherwise would happen just from assessment changes.
Councillor Morgan.
Yes, I want to pick up on 2 comments. One from Councillor Van Holst. I would say certainly you're correct that the industrial ratios have been low over the last period of time. I would also note that our industrial strategy has multiple incentive components to it, and so this is just one of many levers that are used, whether it's the industrial land development strategy or the way that we deal with development charges or a number of other things to ensure that our industrial land strategy is effective, and the report shows that it has been quite effective. On what the mayor said, which is a really important issue, and I remember discussing it last year, and we did write a letter, and you'll be happy to know that in 2.2, we just asked you to write another letter on the same issue when we passed that. And the reason why it's really important, and I've spent some time talking with Mr. Logan about this issue, is it really is a fairness issue for businesses and the discrepancy in the different tax rates that they face. And the province had decided to correct that, and they decided to do that with provincial money. And then they paused that implementation of that correction because they were running deficits, and they promised to bring it back again when they came to a balanced budget, which didn't happen in the brief period of time where the budget was balanced. But it is a fairness issue, and it is something that should be looked at, and it is something that, irrespective of the budget situation, the province should look at. I believe, and I want Mr. Logan to correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the impact on London businesses was somewhere in the range of $10 million, and maybe if I'm wrong, I need him to correct me on that now because I don't want to float the wrong number out there.
Yeah, yes, that was our estimate. I think it is mentioned in the report as well.
good. I remember it from last year, and I must have glanced at it in the report. But that's what we're talking about for an impact on London businesses, is about $10 million in discrepancy in the different tax rates that are faced across the province that needs to be corrected, that there's a plan to correct it, and that plan has been paused. And that's what needs to be addressed to deal with some of the pressures on our commercial tax rate. So I just wanted to share that information. I know if anybody's interested in discussing that, Mr. Logan has all of the previous reports, all of the history, and he's been kind enough to share that with me over the past year as well.
Councillor Van Meebergen.
Thank you, Acting Chair. AB2 as a whole looks quite reasonable. I think if we look at how it spreads out, I mean, the problem here is the minute you start playing with ratios, you start getting into the law of unintended consequences. You're trying to be fair to one group, the other group pays higher. I think this is a really good stretch at achieving fairness across the board and achieving some form of balance. Because on the whole, it seems like we're getting some reductions. We always have to keep in mind that, yes, we want to be fair to the residential class, but by the same token, our wealth creation occurs in the commercial and industrial classes. So we certainly don't want to bite off our nose to spite our face, and so to speak. We don't want to hurt commercial, we don't want to hurt industrial, because that's what provides the jobs, that's what creates jobs, that's what creates wealth in the community. So I think overall, on balance, we have achieved some good economic symmetry, I'd say, in this this proposal. I do have a question though for staff, and that is, if we follow AB2, what does that do to our positioning, if we indeed know that yet, our positioning on page 15 with this Schedule D? Any idea how we would shift by at least realizing that our competitor municipalities are going through the same processes, but would we be more or less going by the 2018 numbers? Are we staying sort of in the middle based on 2018, or are we going to shift a bit?
It would not change it a great deal. I would still categorize it as in the middle range, around the middle. Schedule A might be a little more clearer on that because it shows just the ratio itself rather than the shift. But I would say it's still in the middle area. It would be a little bit improved.
Great, thank you very much.
Any other questions or comments? I'd just like to make a few comments as well. As not a huge mathematical person, but this here got me really excited, and I know that we had sat down with Mrs. Barbone and chatted extensively about it, and even with AB2, even without even with the exclusion of the education taxes, it looks very balanced for me, and it's. For me, multi-residential is something that I really focused on, making sure that we're not having a city that's becoming very unlivable. And I was really excited to follow this process. And thank you for all the information you were able to provide me with. And I'm super happy with AB2, and I look forward to seeing other councils support it. So now, motion has been moved by Councillor Helmer and seconded by Councillor Morgan. Now I'm just going to call to question.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 6-0.
And I'm going to return the chair back to Councillor Morgan.
Thank you, and I see the mayor trying to flag me. I'll see what he's looking for.
Yeah, just a brief comment. When this gets approved through council, be more than pleased to write that letter under 2.2. And do we get retroactive taxes, Mr. Logan? That'd be the only question I might have. That's a little superfluous, but it would be nice.
I wouldn't expect that to happen.
It's always nice to ask. Basically, give us all the money all the time. Next on our agenda, that satisfies the consent items. We don't have any scheduled items. Items for direction, we have a letter from our colleague, Councillor Van Holst. I think what I'll do is I'll go to him to explain his letter and what he's asking of the committee, and then I would open it up for discussion from the committee to take any action that they feel is appropriate on Councillor Van Holst's letter or his commentary. So, Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And through you, I wanted to bring an item forward and wanted to do so very early in the term because we found out last time these kinds of considerations can take so long that we get to the point where it's too late to make a decision for an upcoming council. So when you look at the size of London and our peers and the challenges we face and also the efficiencies that we may be sacrificing, I think London may not be served that well by holding on to a part-time council. I think there's some opportunity for more maturity in our governance model, and that's what I'm hoping we would look at here. But of course, it's going to have to be looked at in a fairly holistic way. So last time at council, you recall, we were looking at just a daytime meetings, and that begged so many other questions that really we have to look at things in a larger perspective. So that's what I'm hoping will happen here. I'm asking to look at, should this be a full-time role? Should we be meeting at the daytime? Do we need the same number of counselors? And of course, if these things change, then the compensation has been brought up again. Compensation, of course, is something that Councillor Usher pointed out last time that we're usually too afraid to talk about. Interestingly, I had a motion similar to this about 4 years ago when we were first going into the compensation task force. I was hoping that we would first make a decision on whether there should be a full or part-time job. I wrote up the motion, I got a seconder, but when I got to council, they met me and said I chickened out and used the word chicken. And then when I looked to somebody else, they said, oh, just let the task force go through. So I realize there's a hesitation to look at these things, but I do believe there's a lot of upside and many benefits that London could achieve by going in a direction like this. So I'll leave my comments at that. I am happy to talk about some other options that we could contemplate, but for the time being, there's my motion. I hope you'll send this off to the government's working group so we can have a discussion about these things.
Okay, I have two pieces of information for the committee as well in preparation for the meeting that I reviewed that I'll share. One is what is the appropriate compensation for a full-time counselor? The last council ended up passing as part of the compensation task force review a process by which compensation would be reviewed during this term of council. So unless this council decides not to do it, that is something that would eventually come forward as a process. And should the number of councillors remain the same or be reduced, it should be made aware to new colleagues in particular that there was a discussion that the clerks alerted us to that a more comprehensive ward boundary review would occur during this term of council because of the misalignments in populations between the wards. That may have an impact on the number or size of council in some way. I mean, certainly council can make decisions on that, but there will be another piece of information that will be available through a ward boundary review on, you know, population representation, those sorts of things. So I just wanted colleagues to be aware of two processes that will be ongoing that are related to these items, as well as we have the discussion that the councillors asked us to have. And I would open this up to committee members for comments. So what the councillor has done is written a letter. He's provided us a request to send this to the governance working group. That will not happen unless the committee actually decides to send that on. And so that's what we're considering is the councillor's letter today. So I'll look for speakers. Mayor Holder.
Chair, based on what you said, just a clarification with the commitment to look at boundaries, to look at a number of issues relating to pay, to full part-time. Will that be happening through the governance working group already? Can you just clarify that? Because if that's the case, that perhaps meshes into this, but I'm trying to get a sense of where that falls. Could I ask you that, please?
Yeah, I'm going to have the deputy clerk answer that.
Thank you. And through the chair, there is an existing council policy that will direct the requirement for a ward boundary review. And it's my understanding that the city clerk will be reporting back to this committee to make recommendations with respect to that ward boundary review in the relatively near future. And with respect to the compensation task force, the previous recommendations were that the council compensation be reviewed in adequate time in advance of the next election. So there would be an additional report that would come forward to initiate that process sometime in this term.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Through you then to the deputy clerk. What parameters is the clerk using then to consider boundaries? Is the clerk looking at equalization of boundaries? Have we set the terms of reference for what that review would look like? Is it being looked at in relation to potentially lesser councillors? I'm trying to get a sense of the parameter perspective that and the view that the clerk is looking at as this consideration is undertaken.
My understanding, and I'll let the deputy clerk jump in, is that the report that would come forward to this committee for consideration would set those parameters, at which point council could obviously engage on establishing new parameters or boundaries to consider in the assessment. And so there would be a report that would come forward outlining the process that would be undertaken and the types of things you're talking about. At that time, the committee could debate and suggest different parameters or different considerations to be used in the discussion. I see nodding, so.
Then, Chair, through you, would some of the considerations as proposed by Councillor Van Holst, could they well be part of the direction and review at that time?
There would be no reason why that couldn't happen.
Then the obvious component of this might well be that could we refer this recommendation to that review that the clerk's undertaking that'll come before this committee at that time, rather than sequestering it to the governance working group. It just feels like it makes some sense to me. Would like your thoughts on that.
What I would say is there are certainly components that we were referring to that would be appropriate for that process. I think what we have is a number of different processes occurring. This number one, should the role be considered full-time? That isn't really something that is going to be considered in, I think, any existing process. So if that should be considered, that probably should be, some sort of action should be taken on that. The number of councillors remain the same or reduced. That could be dealt with certainly through the report that comes forward with, you know, the ward boundary parameters. It could be one of the items that was layered onto that assessment that bring forward a set of boundaries that only has X number of wards. That would obviously change the size of council. The compensation process, what would be appropriate compensation, as was described, will happen. But should committee meetings be held primarily during the day, that is a process that is a discussion when we set the annual meeting calendar, and a discussion that the governance working group has had previously. And so to have another discussion on that is probably, you probably should land that. So number one and number three should probably land somewhere. Otherwise, I don't think that they would get captured in existing processes. Number 2 and 4 could. Oh, and the deputy clerk's going to add something.
Through you, Mr. Chair, just with respect to number 3 about committee meetings being held primarily during the day, just trying to keep the context here, but there is another report coming back with respect to the meeting calendar that will be for 2020. These are sort of sequential questions, so it's up to the committee how you want to deal with them.
Councillor Van Meerbergen.
Well, it seems like we're spending an inordinate amount of time on ourselves. That's certainly how it feels. We've just gone through the whole pay raise debate and so on. And what I'm gaining, the thrust of what I'm seeing here is basically to push towards full-time. And to my understanding, there's really no way to adjudicate full-time. What is full-time? So really, the bottom line is another pay hike. This is another way to rationale more money for councillors. And so I don't want to engage in this, and so I'm prepared to move a motion to receive for information.
Okay, that is a motion that can be made. I would need a seconder for that particular motion. Seconded by Councillor Hillier. So the motion on the floor is to receive for information. Discussion on that. Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. I wanted to say to Councillor Van Holst, thank you for bringing forward the question. The more I've worked on these particular issues, it's now been a few years, the more I realize it's mostly about, do you want to meet during the day? And I think that's something we need to resolve. There's nothing really saying that, you know, people can't have other employment outside of whatever they're doing as a councillor. There won't be, regardless of how we answer those questions. And that's true for members of parliament. It's true for members of provincial parliament. There's no requirement saying this has to be the thing that you work on. What there are norms and expectations around, you know, if you work during the day on these things, you don't do these other things at night. And the expectation is that because we have a lot of meetings in the evenings, that people are going to have other employment during the day. That's not always the case. We've had lots of retired people who are councillors that don't have employment during the day, and all they're working on is council. We've got people who've given up jobs either fully or completely to just work at being a councillor. We've got lots of full-time councillors and a history of having people who are primarily focused on council. What we have had is a system of meetings that pushes a lot of the meetings into the evening. And I think that is the problem. And that's where we're really out of step with a lot of other municipalities, is that our committee meetings and our council meetings are in the evening. And especially for the meetings that go on for very long periods of time, I think that is not a good situation. It's not good for the staff. We've had to be here from the morning until the very late at night. It's not good for the councillors, especially those who have other things that they're doing during the day, and then they're coming and doing 10 hours of meetings into the evening. So I think the issue around when the meetings are happening, the committee meetings and the council meetings, that is really the fundamental issue on which everything else turns. Because I think if we were meeting during the day, people's expectations would be is that they would be paid appropriately. Because right now, the weird situation is there's nothing stopping somebody from wanting to be a councillor, having the meetings during the day, and then working a shift in a factory overnight. I mean, like, you know, that you could do that. But that is not the norm and expectation, is that somebody would have a schedule or a life that works like that. The expectation is that you have some kind of 9 to 5 white collar job, and then you meet in the evening, right? And that's the sort of historical legacy of how the kind of people who have applied and been elected to council, is that that's their background. And so this schedule works fine for that. But it really does not work for the schedule of a lot of other people who have other kinds of employment that happens at other times of the day. And so I think that's where we need to start focusing on the discussion, is when are we gonna have the meetings, and how is the meeting schedule impacting some of our decision making? I think the compensation discussion follows after that, and I think we've solved a lot of it by switching it to be the full-time median income for an individual, because, I mean, that is a full-time wage in the City of London. It's exactly a full-time wage, in fact. And I think we've kind of dealt with that piece. The part that's really outstanding is, when are we gonna have the meetings? And I think we're gonna keep talking about that. It's one of these issues that councillors themselves are not that good at talking about. I would include myself in it, because we have our own preferences. You know, we all applied to be councillors knowing what the time of the meetings were. And so once we get elected, we kind of want to keep things the way they are, and it's very hard to make any kind of changes. So I think that is a difficult one. I think, like many of these things, the ward boundary review, the compensation, I think this is one that we really benefit from some independent advice about when should these meetings be happening. Leaving it to ourselves to decide when do you want to have meetings. It really is going to be a function of what are our personal schedules, what can we, can't, how flexible are we or are we not? And I think it becomes a very paralyzing kind of decision-making process where nothing really changes. So hopefully we can make some improvements on the daytime meetings part, because I think that from a decision-making perspective, that's the single biggest thing we could do to improve things during this term of council and potentially out into the future. As far as I'm aware, nobody who switched to daytime meetings has ever gone back to having all the meetings in the evening.
I have myself next on the speakers list and then Mayor Holder. So I'm going to hand, actually, for my comments, I'm going to hand the chair over to Councillor Kaibaga before I speak.
Councillor Morgan.
So I appreciate the motion that was made, but I do want to make some comments on the letter in particular. They're not going to be too pleasant because I'm pretty annoyed at some of the comments that I've read in the media on this. Particular comments like, if this is your only role, you can be very focused on the job. You're not distracted by other things. So I am one who has another job. And I can tell you I'm very focused on my council work. I spend full-time hours on my council work in addition to my job at the university, of which I take a reduced responsibility and lower my hours to as many as I can possibly lower them to and still maintain that position. Because for me, I quite enjoy serving in this capacity, but it is not a long-term career to serve in politics. It is something that is a great honor to have, but certainly something where I do want to maintain my other position, because I will go back to that one day and enjoy that work as well. But I want to tell you, like, this idea that we're not working full-time, we are working full-time. I'm doing counselor stuff full-time, and I can tell you I'm not focused on stuff. And for anybody who thinks that, because I've heard some colleagues on the radio talking about this as well, it's not the case. I chair 2 of our committees, a working group in this. I chaired the budget process at the request of council, and I've been asked to chair the multi-year budget process. And from all feedback that I've received from my colleagues, they're very happy with the work that I'm doing. So I don't want this idea to be out there that people who have other commitments can't fully commit to this particular position. Whether it's a job, whether it's family, whether it's other things, we all have other commitments in our lives, and we devote the amount of time to this job that we can and that is appropriate to serve our constituents to the level that we feel we should serve them. And I remind people that I got 75% of the vote last time while maintaining 2 jobs. My constituents seem very happy with the service that they're getting, and I'll continue to serve them in that capacity to the best of my ability. But I'm not going to not make comments when people are saying that there's this notion out there that if someone has another job, that they're not doing as good a job as someone else in this horseshoe. I think each of us do the best job we do with the circumstances that we have, and everybody contributes in a very meaningful way around this horseshoe, regardless of their approach to doing that job. And that's actually one of the great things about an elected council is we can all take flexibility in our approaches to the way we serve our constituents, because we all represent different parts of the city. We all bring different life experiences and perspectives to this, and I think that there is strength in those who have those other life experiences. So, is it a full-time job? I think it already is. So there's no actual definition in any municipal legislation that requires us to define it one way or another. It's certainly full-time hours for me. So to me, that means it's a full-time job. What is the consequence of declaring that? There's literally none. Unless you're looking to change the compensation rate, in which case just have a discussion about the compensation rate rather than talk about this full-time, part-time thing, because it stopped being part-time a long time ago, and I don't think any colleague around this table would not recognize that we put in a lot of hours and we enjoy doing it, and we all get our jobs done. So that's all I'm going to say, and I'm probably not going to weigh into this debate again.
Mayor Holder.
Thanks very much, Chair. I agree with Councillor Morgan, and I pay great tribute to all the councillors as I've had the opportunity to see them, whether they have chosen by virtue of formally declaring that they are full-time, notwithstanding that is not the actual employment arrangement per se. There isn't anyone that doesn't give heart and soul to this place, in my view. And everyone around this horseshoe makes contributions in different ways. And I need to pay tribute to that because I see it as someone who is, quote, full-time. And we can define that in whatever way that we wish. But I will tell you, council members around this horseshoe put in extraordinary service. And whether they have another, I hate to say competing career or competing attention to their role beyond city council is another matter. But positive marks to councillors who do that. And so if this is ultimately simply a question, not of whether it's daytime or nighttime meetings, but of compensation, then I would say, let's call that out and have that discussion straight on. But you know, it's interesting, last night we had a committee meeting and it was a late afternoon meeting. As you know, they start 4 o'clock. The place was packed and now there was one particular interest focus, but the room was packed, and I'd like to honor our sole guest in the gallery today for a daytime meeting. I appreciate that you're here, but it makes a statement that you care, and to say that people aren't here doesn't mean they do not. But one of the advantages often of later afternoon meetings is that you will get a broader representation just because people's lives are full and busy. So if we're going to deal with these things, I prefer dealing with them a candid, straight up way. And I guess the other point is that at some point, if the issue then becomes whether this is a formally a full-time role or not, it won't just get our attention. I can tell you there will be some folks down the road in a city modestly bigger than ours who will take great attention to that formalities of declaration, which is why I'm glad that doesn't, certainly not my focus, but if it is, it will, I think this will be a very different council and it'll be a very different look. But I didn't want to go down that road either, only to say that I think the commitment that we have from councillors today is as full-time in their physical time as it is in their attitude towards the work they do, and I applaud that.
Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you, and thank you for your comments. So allow me to extend an apology if that's how this was interpreted, as if anybody's not doing a good job. I think we've got a great council. I'd point out that, one scoop of rum raisin ice cream tastes just as good as 2 scoops, and maybe I want 2 scoops of Councillor Morgan. So that my thoughts about this. And the reason it came up is that London's got some big challenges. We've got homelessness, we've got poverty, we've got addiction, we've got some big challenges. And I know that when I'm dealing with challenges like, let's say I want to renovate a bathroom. Well, if I take a week off work, I can finish the whole thing and get it done in that week. If I want to try to do it in the evenings after work, then it's gonna drag out for months. And I see some opportunities for us to be moving faster as a city, and I think it falls in line with these things. The full-time idea really just came out of the AMCTO report, which looked at councils and said, these ones are full-time, these ones are part-time, and so we would fall into that part-time schedule. The reason I use that term is not because we're not already using working full-time hours, it's just that that's how they classified the other comparators, all of which were full-time. And of course, the idea is really what we're doing and what we're able to do during the day, as Councillor Helmer pointed out. And there's a number of different ways we could be doing work. Let me suggest something we might think about. Of course, I've mentioned the number of councillors, and this was because it was brought up by Deputy Mayor Hubert, who said maybe we should have a fewer number of councillors. And I think we're definitely going to have that conversation beforehand, because if we just ask staff to equalize the boundaries, it's just going to give us 14 wards with a more even distribution. This is a change that we would have to initiate, I think, a change in the number. But he suggests maybe 10 wards, or 10 councillors and 10 wards. It could be 5 wards, in northwest, southeast, and center with 2 councillors each. These are kinds of things we could talk about. But were we to do things during the day, I see some interesting possibilities, because at this point, everybody would be available during the day. And we could actually have a system where we don't have standing committees. We have a committee of the whole. Imagine this situation. We meet as a committee of the whole Monday afternoon. Monday evening, we have public participation meetings. Tuesday morning, we meet, finish off as a committee of the whole, and Tuesday evening, we meet as council. And at that council meeting, we pass all the things that were unanimous and go through easily. The things that are somewhat controversial, we could push those off to the next week's cycle, where we would have, as Councillor Morgan has asked a number of times, some time between deciding them on committee and for the SPPC and when council has it. But what this would allow us to do is have a cycle that happens every week instead of every 2 weeks. I think we could have our throughput much faster. So there's a more efficient way to run our council. And then what I hope for is that during some of those off days, we have some more working groups where council is actually working hard on stuff rather than simply pushing things off to staff to do the work. I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to make decisions ahead of time before we ask staff to come up with a whole bunch of options and come back to us. I see tremendous efficiencies if we did things differently. And of course, there's all the efficiencies that we've already talked about of being here with them during the day. And that's been my experience. If you're here during the day, you can meet with staff and spend a lot of time working the same hours that they're working and we expect them to working. So what I see, whether or not you like the way you've interpreted my questions, I still think for us to have a discussion where we actually have the discussion and can look at some of these things at a government's working group, that would give us some way to decide how to move forward. I'm not saying there's anything specific here. I'm not looking for any particular compensation. It's just that was brought up as well. So these things are all in here. I've tried to include everything that we would need to talk about, and just an initial conversation that would be better than, no, we don't like your idea, I think would be valuable for us. And we might see some way into the future that's better. So what I hope, obviously you could just receive this, at which point I'll say, well, let's at least send something to the governance working group, because we're going to have a discussion somewhere. Those are my thoughts. If I haven't heard a lot of, well, those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Further discussion. So I'll just note for colleagues that the motion on the floor, moved by Councillor Van Meerberg and seconded by Councillor Hillier, is to basically receive Councillor Van Holst's communication for information. So further discussion from colleagues. Seeing none, then I'll open that for voting.
Closing the vote, that motion's passed 4-2.
Okay. Okay, and I'll note that that was received for information. It wasn't take no action, so it doesn't preclude these matters from coming up through the other processes that were described or at another time during the council processes. That is our item for direction. Deferred matters and additional business. I don't have any, unless colleagues have any. Seeing none. Then we have 3 confidential items. You'll have to see the third one is on the added agenda. That is all that remains on our committee agenda. So in a second, I'll look for a motion to go into closed session. What I will do is we will come out of closed session in the committee room, and then we will adjourn from there, assuming there's no one in the hallway who wants to see the adjournment. But we will make that effort to look, and so I'll look for that motion. I see Deputy Mayor Helmer, seconded by Councillor Hillier, and we'll vote on the screen.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 6-0.